Welcome to Told in Stone. This video explores 3 ancient conspiracy theories: an outbreak of hysteria in classical Athens, a plot at the court of Alexander, and a crusade against a mysterious Persian cult. But before I tell those stories, I have an announcement. I have started 2 new YouTube channels to complement my videos here on Told in Stone. One of the new channels is called Scenic Routes to the Past. Scenic Routes is a travel channel which follows my journeys to various historical destinations. Unlike Told in Stone, it is not focused exclusively on ancient history. The first 2 videos, which you can view now, document my quest to find a railroad lost in the Alaskan wilderness. My other new channel is called Told in Stone Footnotes. This channel hosts episodes of my podcast, in which I interview some of the most interesting historians working today. It also features Q&A videos, live streams, and much more. If you could take a moment to subscribe to my new channels, I would deeply appreciate it. Thank you for your time. And now, without any further ado, ancient conspiracy theories. A conspiracy theory arises in the hazy gulf between suspicion and fact. It is discussed, accepted, rejected, dismissed. It may be definitively debunked. It may even be proven. But it exists independently of any verifiable source, living in the court of public opinion, feeding on itself. Ancient history is full of conspiracies, in the sense of coordinated plots against power. Famous examples include the Catilinarian conspiracy, an attempt, thwarted by Cicero, to overthrow the Republic, the Pisonian conspiracy, which sought to supplant Nero, and the Barbarian conspiracy, an apparently concerted attack on Roman Britain by the Picts, Saxons, and Irish. There are fewer instances of conspiracy theories in the most familiar sense, that is, the assumption that a secret organization is pulling strings behind the scenes. Speculation about those in power, of course, is as old as civilization itself, and our sources reverberate with rumors about the undue influence of courtiers and relatives of rulers. Claims that the whole political system was being subverted, however, tended to emerge only in periods of acute crisis. The affair of the Herms in classical Athens is one of the best documented examples. Athens, famously, had a democratic government in which a large part of the citizen body took part. In combination with a lively tradition of criticizing public figures, epitomized by the comedies of Aristophanes, the immediacy of the democracy made the schemes and scandals of prominent politicians a popular conversation topic. The most talked about of all Athenian politicians was the brilliant, charming, and utterly unscrupulous aristocrat Alcibiades. A scion of the same family that had produced Pericles, Alcibiades made his name by promoting an aggressive foreign policy against Sparta and her allies. He was admired for his compelling speeches before the assembly, and for such political stunts as entering no fewer than 7 awesomely expensive chariots in the Olympics. His dissolute private life, however, led many Athenians to distrust him, and set the stage for the affair of the Herms. Herms were small statues placed at crossroads and beside doorways. They consisted of a simple stone pillar topped by a god's head and garnished with a prominent erect phallus. In the spring of 415 BC, just as the Athenian government, spurred by Alcibiades, was about to launch a vast armada to conquer Sicily, nearly all the Herms in Athens had their noses, and phalluses, knocked off. While this might seem like a harmless prank, the mutilation of the Herms threw Athens into a frenzy. Herms, after all, were images of the gods, and any injury to them was sacrilege. That so many divine images had been damaged at the outset of the Sicilian expedition seemed a bad omen, and a conspiracy theory arose that the Herms had been broken by a secret cabal that sought to destroy the government. You know what isn't a conspiracy theory? Tiege Hanley's Skincare for Men, the sponsor of this video. Tiege Hanley makes affordable, easy-to-use products. which, as a busy YouTuber with rather dry skin, I find very helpful. I'd recommend starting with the Level 1 system, which includes a daily face wash, a bi-weekly exfoliating scrub, and both AM and PM moisturizers. Every box comes with an instruction card that helps you get the most out of your products. Don't just take my word for it. Tiege Hanley has received more than 5,000 5-star reviews on their website from satisfied customers around the world. To become one of those satisfied customers, sign up for Tiege Hanley and get discounts on all products, the ability to customize your boxes, and much more. As a special offer for Toll & Stone viewers, if you click on the link in the description, you'll get 30% off your first box, plus a free gift. So take advantage of this exceptional deal. Click that link and get started today. Back to classical Athens. A public investigation brought additional information to light. Shortly before the Herms were mutilated, a group of young men had broken other sacred statues and mimicked the Eleusinian Mysteries, the most sacred Athenian ritual. One of the participants, it was said, had been Alcibiades. It began to be whispered that Alcibiades had also been responsible for smashing the Herms, and that his acts of sacrilege were part of a plot to overthrow the democracy. As one of the leaders of the Sicilian expedition, Alcibiades was forced to leave the city before he could clear his name. In his absence, the conspiracy theory continued to grow, connecting the mutilation of the Herms and violation of the Mysteries with an aristocratic scheme to replace the government. When a small Spartan force was reported nearby, it was immediately assumed that they had been summoned by the conspirators. Arrests were made, armed patrols were posted in the city center, and finally, Alcibiades himself was summoned back to Athens to be tried for his supposed crimes. Although it's entirely plausible that Alcibiades mimicked the Mysteries with his friends, and not impossible that he was associated with the men who maimed the Herms, there is no reason to think that he was plotting to overthrow the democracy. Aristocratic coups were a legitimate threat. There would be 2 within a decade of the Sicilian expedition, but Alcibiades had little to gain from overthrowing a government that had just awarded him an important command. In this case, he seems to have been nothing more or less than the victim of a conspiracy theory. To a degree that a democratic leader like Alcibiades could only envy, monarchs dominated both public discourse and popular suspicion in antiquity. The most familiar examples are the Roman emperors, whose plots, perversions, and peccadillos pervade our sources. Emperors were frequently implicated in conspiracy theories, especially, and understandably, when their predecessors perished under suspicious circumstances. Perhaps the most interesting conspiracy theory involving a classical ruler, however, centers on the death of Alexander the Great. Alexander died at Babylon on June 10, 323 BC, aged 32. According to his most reliable ancient biographers, he had fallen ill 10 days before, during, or shortly after, a wine-soaked banquet. His illness began as a fever, mild enough, at first, for the king to ignore as he prepared to invade Arabia. Within a few days, however, he had become too weak to sit up or speak. Still burning with fever, he lapsed into a coma and never woke. An alternative tradition added dramatic details. At the final banquet, according to this version of events, Alexander was draining a goblet of wine when he cried out in pain. Collapsing, he was carried away by his friends and lay in agony until the final coma overtook him. Almost as soon as Alexander died, it began to be rumored that he had been poisoned. The culprit, it was said, was Antipater, the king's regent in Europe, who had sent his young son Aeolus to dose Alexander's cup with a potion prepared by Aristotle. Aristotle certainly had reason to resent Alexander. He had been the king's tutor, and when the Persian campaign began, he sent his nephew Callisthenes to accompany the Macedonian army and write a history of its conquests. Alexander, however, proceeded to execute Callisthenes on a trumped-up treason charge. As might be imagined, this did not improve relations with the young historian's uncle. According to the rumors that sprouted after Alexander's death, Aristotle had procured water from the bitter springs of the river Styx, whose deadly water would dissolve any container, besides the hoof of a mule. With the connivance of Antipater's son Cassander, and a very literal drug mule, the poison made its way to Babylon and to the king's cup. The Styx water is legendary, and the involvement of Aristotle supremely unlikely. That Alexander was poisoned, however, is not beyond the realm of possibility. Alexander's mother Olympias believed, or claimed to believe, that Antipater was responsible for her son's death. She executed several men on charges of involvement in the plot, and dishonored the supposed poisoner Aeolus by exhuming his body and scattering the bones. Antipater's son Cassander, Aeolus's brother, returned the favor by killing Olympias and leaving her body to rot unburied. He also took vengeance on Hyperides, an Athenian orator who had dared to propose honoring Aeolus for poisoning Alexander. After Hyperides was captured by Cassander's bounty hunter, his tongue was cut out, he was executed, and his body, like that of Olympias, was left to be devoured by the birds and beasts. The dramatic sequence of accusations and murders that followed Alexander's death does not, of course, prove that the king was poisoned. Our most reliable ancient sources roundly reject the theory, which seems to be a product of popular suspicion and political maneuvering. Although we'll never know for certain, malaria, aggravated by alcoholism and old battle wounds, is a far more likely culprit for Alexander's death than poison. Not far from Babylon, but more than half a millennium after the death of Alexander, the deadliest of all ancient conspiracy theories began in a small Mesopotamian village where a prophet named Mani started to preach a new religion. Mani's creed, which we call Manichaeism, proclaimed a universal conflict between the powers of light and darkness. To ensure the ultimate triumph of the light, a chosen few, the elect, were called upon to renounce all their possessions and devote their lives to rituals combating the darkness. It was the duty of all other believers, the hearers, to support the elect with alms, and so gain a chance to be reborn as an elect and finally escape the prison of the flesh. With the personal support of the Shah, Mani proselytized throughout the Persian Empire, proclaiming a religion that perfected and replaced the teachings of Jesus, Zoroaster, and the Buddha. Missionaries were sent to India, to the steppes of Central Asia, and into the Roman Empire. Ada, one of Mani's chief disciples, led the first Roman mission, which established communities in the provinces of Syria and Egypt. Equipped with translations of Mani's scriptures, and trained to engage philosophers and priests in theological debate, Manichaean preachers gained converts rapidly, sowing cells of believers from Alexandria to Rome. Traditionally, the Romans were tolerant of any religion that respected the established social and political order. Sects that seemed to encourage rebellion or disloyalty, however, were repressed. The most famous example is the Christian Church, but instances stretched back to the Republic, which had crushed the cult of Bacchus for inciting immoral behavior. In 302, Diocletian was notified of disruptions caused by Manichaean preaching in the province of Africa. The more the emperor learned about the new religion, the more alarmed he became. Mani had been a friend of the Persian Shah, the arch-enemy of all things Roman. To Diocletian and his advisors, this seemed a clear indication that Manichaeism was nothing less than a Persian plot intended to overthrow the Roman Empire. In an imperial edict, Diocletian proclaimed that the Manichaeans were seeking to infect the, quote, innocent, orderly, and tranquil Roman people with the, quote, damnable customs and perverse laws of the Persians, as with the poison of a malignant serpent. Any Roman who converted to Manichaeism would be executed. Any official who supported the cult would be sent to the mines. And the Manichaean preachers themselves were to be burned alive atop piles of their scriptures. As the great persecution of the Christians would soon demonstrate, the provincial governors responsible for enforcing imperial edicts were not always enthusiastic about doing so, and most Manichaeans seem to have escaped punishment. Throughout the 4th century and beyond, however, emperors continued to issue edicts stripping Manichaeans of their civil rights, declaring them outlaws, and condemning them to death. As the Roman Empire became Christian, the Manichaeans were branded heretics and corrupters of the faith. St. Augustine, a former convert to Manichaeism, was the most famous of the many Christian thinkers who attacked the so-called Persian heresy. Increasingly savage penalties drove the sect underground and eventually expelled it from the empire. Manichaeism was never actually a Persian plot. Although Mani had indeed enjoyed court patronage for a time, he had died in prison, and his religion was being persecuted in its native land by the Zoroastrian priesthood long before Diocletian issued his edict. Yet the Roman crusade against the Manichaeans lasted, with interruptions, for more than 2 centuries. In keeping with the late imperial synthesis of church and state, it became an issue of both policy and belief. But it had its origins in the fatal simplicity of a conspiracy theory. Click the link in the upper right for the exciting content on my new travel channel, including my journey along Alaska's Copper River. For the Told in Stone podcast and other interactive content, follow this link to my other new channel, Told in Stone Footnotes. Thanks to Tish Hanley for sponsoring this video. You'll find their link in the description. You can sign up for exclusive Told in Stone content on Patreon. You might also enjoy my book, Naked Statues, Fat Gladiators, and War Elephants. Thanks for watching.